Well, welcome again to another program of Christian Answers for Today. We are doing more in the line of movie reviews today. We're jumping back and forth between different topics today on this show. And today we are continuing to review the series on television on NBC called The Bible Continues, AD, The Bible Continues. And so we're going to be talking about that today. And I hope everything's going well in your life. I hope you've had a chance to watch some of these made-for-television movies that are coming out on the Bible. And the one we're going to be talking about today is a continuation of the series last year, or the year before, excuse me, called The Bible. And that was aired on the History Channel. And people responded to that. They really liked that. And so they have produced some more, and it picks up where the other series left off, which was at the resurrection. And now this series talks about what happens after the resurrection and what happens with the disciples after Jesus ascends into heaven. And so it's an exciting series because I think one of the first times there has been treatment of what the disciples did after Christ ascended into heaven. Usually depictions in movies and usually in depictions in the series, TV specials, documentaries. It shows the life and times of Jesus Christ, but it normally doesn't deal with what happens after Jesus and what happens with the disciples. And in this one, they actually go into what it was like to be the disciples. And there were some different interpretations, different understandings of what actually took place after Jesus had risen and ascended into heaven. It showed some very interesting interaction between the Jewish leadership at that time and the Roman leadership at that time. There was, of course, Caiaphas, the high priest, and then there was Pontius Pilate. And these two men, the series shows, had a very back and forth relationship. As you know, the Jewish elders, the Pharisees, Caiaphas as high priest, and the scholars and the scribes of the Jewish nation, they came to Pilate. They wanted Jesus to be put to death because of his teachings about him being the Messiah. And they did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and so they wanted that to be stopped. They wanted that teaching to be stopped. So they went to Pilate. Pilate agreed to hear Jesus, have Jesus stand before him. And as you recall from the scriptures, Pilate said, I find nothing wrong with this man. He can be flogged and released. And the Jewish elders and the high priest did not want that. They did not accept that conclusion because to them he was a threat to their way of life, their religious perspective, and they wanted him dead. They didn't want any of his teachings spreading throughout the nation. And so then Pilate turned him over to the soldiers for crucifixion. He was crucified, and then the Jewish elders, and it showed here in the series Caiaphas coming to Pontius Pilate during the time period between the burial of Jesus after his crucifixion and Sunday morning and saying, would you please post Roman soldiers at the guards, seal the tomb to make sure that none of his followers would steal the body and then claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. Because Jesus had prophesied, he had predicted, he had spoken of rising from the dead on a number of occasions, and I guess the Jewish leaders wanted to make sure that could never be a rumor, it could never be a teaching or superstition that Jesus rose from the dead. So they said, post guards on the tomb and seal it, and then we will not have any rumors of Jesus rising from the dead. So that is what Pilate did. He sent some soldiers. And then in the series, in the TV show here, it shows also that the temple police went along also. So you had actually two sets of guards. You had Pontius Pilate and his soldiers, the Roman soldiers, sealing the tomb and guarding it. And then you also had the temple police from Caiaphas, and they were also there at the site. Now the movie, the series here, shows what happened, tried to recreate what happened, and what they show is a huge, gigantic, glowing, luminous angel dressed in warrior battle gear standing on the tomb, and the soldiers were petrified. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't respond. They were totally shocked. Here was this supernatural being, this creature descending from heaven, standing on the tomb, and with a sword in his hand, and they just stood as dead men. That's what the scripture says. And then in the movie, it pretty much showed the same thing. There was a very good depiction of what probably happened at that tomb. The soldiers just stared. They could not move. They could not believe what they were seeing. They saw this huge angel, and then the angel proceeded to move this huge stone away from the entrance of the tomb, and that's all that scene shows. It does not show Jesus actually leaving the tomb. It does not show the soldiers running away. But then in the next episode, the one we're talking about today, it shows that the soldiers, the Roman soldiers, were huddled in some area, some house in Jerusalem away from Pontius Pilate, because they were too ashamed to admit that they had let the tomb, the seal, break, and the tomb was open. And so they were huddled, hiding from Pontius Pilate. They knew that they were in trouble. And the temple guards, the temple police, went to Caiaphas and reported that the tomb is now open and that the body is gone. And so they weren't as afraid as the soldiers, because Caiaphas wanted to know. And so Caiaphas, it shows in this movie, it showed Caiaphas searching for the body. And he tries to get some people together to look for the corpse of Jesus, because he was convinced that the disciples did indeed steal the body from the tomb. Even though there were soldiers there from both the Roman army and the temple police, Caiaphas somehow believed that the followers of Jesus had somehow gotten in and stolen the body. And so he went about the task of trying to find the corpse of Jesus to put it back in there, or to put it up on a tree, or put it up in the air to show everybody, hey, Jesus is still dead. He has not risen. And so that was his goal. And it's kind of a comical situation in the series. It shows one of his workers comes to him and says, okay, we've got the body. And Caiaphas comes down to view the body of the corpse of Jesus and looks down and says, this is not Jesus. So his workers had somehow found a dead body and had made the marks of crucifixion upon this dead corpse, and were trying to pass it off as Jesus Christ. And they told Caiaphas, they said, don't worry, if this body is up in the air hanging, nobody will know the difference. And so Caiaphas didn't buy that. He said, no way, they will know. People are not that stupid. And so he tells them to find the real body of Jesus Christ. So that was an interesting twist in the story, in the movie, in the TV series. And so did it happen? We don't know for sure. The Bible doesn't say that there was some kind of effort to try to come up with the body of Jesus Christ. The Bible doesn't say that Caiaphas went about searching for the corpse of Christ after the tomb had been found empty. But it is a plausible, possible activity that he might have led 2,000 and some years ago to try to get that body back into the tomb, or to show people that Jesus hadn't risen from the dead. So it's a very interesting thing. But we're going to talk more about the depictions in the movie and in the series in just a minute. Stay with us for part 2. Well, we're back for part 2 of Christian Answers, and we're talking about the made-for-television series, Jesus of Nazareth, and the Bible Continues. And so we are talking about the time between Jesus' death and his burial, and then the resurrection on Sunday. Now, the disciples, it continues to show that some of the disciples are believing that Jesus possibly might rise from the dead, and then others, like Peter, did not believe that that was a live option. And but an interesting part in the movie, on the TV series, is that it shows the disciples on the run from the Romans, because Pontius Pilate, when he learns about the grave being open and the body being gone, once he learns that, he then decides to round up the disciples, because he believes that they were the ones responsible for the tomb being empty, that they had stolen it somehow, they had manufactured and tricked the guards or something. He puts it upon the disciples' shoulder as to what actually happened. And so he tells his soldiers to go round up the disciples. And so they're looking for the disciples all throughout Jerusalem. And the disciples, they have tried to figure out how to get out of town. But of course, Peter said we should wait until the third day to see if Jesus actually does rise from the dead, like some of you are saying. Well, he does indeed appear to them in the upper room. They are gathered and together, and all of a sudden, Jesus is there in the midst of them. And he appears, and he has wounds in his side, he has wounds in his hands, and he says, "Be not afraid, it is me." And in the TV series, the Bible continues, it actually shows Jesus asking for some food, and it shows him eating some bread. And so he eats with them, he breaks bread with them, and then there's a knock at the door, and it's Thomas who has been eluding the soldiers and makes it up to the upper room. And so they go to the door and they see who it is, and when they turn around, Jesus is gone. And so then they tell Thomas, "We have seen the Lord," and he doesn't believe it. He's doubting Thomas, and he says, "No, unless I see the marks in my hand, at the hands of Jesus, and feel them, I will not believe." And then at that time, Mary Magdalene comes in and says, "Thomas, I have seen the Lord. He appeared to me outside of the tomb, and it's definitely the Lord." So now you have Mary Magdalene and you have these disciples who were in the upper room saying that they have seen the risen Christ. And here is Thomas, who has not seen the risen Christ, and he's doubting. He's saying, "Nope, I don't believe it. I don't buy it." So that's very realistic. That's very realistic, because when you think about it, from the biblical evidence, the disciples did not expect the resurrection to occur. Even though Jesus had talked about it time and time again, they just couldn't get themselves to believe that it could actually happen. And here, when some of the disciples actually see Jesus risen from the dead, Mary Magdalene sees Jesus risen from the dead. So you have all of this testimony, this eyewitness testimony. Thomas, being one of the disciples, says he still doesn't believe. He still can't believe. He has to see it to believe it. And so in the TV series, he goes to the tomb and reports back that the Romans are sealing the tomb again. And so they ask, well, why would they do that again? And they conclude that they want to make it appear that Jesus is in the tomb. They want to make it the appearance that nothing had gone wrong, that Jesus' body was still in there, and they were still guarding the tomb, and the seal is still on the tomb seal rock that stands in front of it. And so they were going to try to, according to this depiction, they were trying to stage, the Romans were, that everything was okay, that the seal had not been broken, and that Jesus' body was still in the tomb. And they were guarding an empty tomb, knowing that it was an empty tomb, but trying to betray to the public that Jesus was still dead and he's still in this tomb, and there's no resurrection, and there's no need for rumors or superstition. And so Thomas comes in and reports to the disciples all of this in the upper room. And at the moment he's in there, Jesus suddenly appears to Thomas and shows him his hands, the nail marks, and the side where the spear was thrust into his side. And he said, be now believing, Thomas, don't doubt. And then he says, blessed are those who believe, who have not seen. And at that moment, that was a very biblical passage, because that's exactly what Jesus said. And that applies directly to us today, because we were not there like the disciples were there. And we have to rely on the testimony of the disciples and those who he appeared to. And Jesus is giving us a blessing. He says, blessed are those who believe, who have not seen. And that is basically addressing people like you and me and other believers in the world today, because we have not seen Jesus like the disciples saw him in the first century, risen from the dead. But we believe that he has risen from the dead because we believe the testimony of the disciples, and we believe the reports. And we look at the Christian church and we say to ourselves, how in the world could Christianity begin? How could it grow in the middle of Jerusalem, in the middle of a hostile environment, if Jesus Christ hadn't actually risen from the dead? How could it happen? It couldn't happen. It would be impossible. The Jews would simply bring the body of Jesus Christ out of the tomb, show everybody the dead corpse of Christ if he had not risen, and that would have been the end of the Jesus movement. There is no way that Peter and the other disciples could have preached a risen Christ if in fact Jesus had died and his body was still in the tomb. So the body was not in the tomb. The tomb was empty. And the Jewish people have always believed, according to the report, that the disciples had stolen the body. But the problem with that is, if the Jewish authorities went to Pilate and said, we need some soldiers to guard the tomb, and they sent Roman soldiers to guard the tomb, and the temple police had also gone to guard the tomb. So you had this commission of soldiers right there at the tomb. The tomb is sealed. How can you have the followers of Jesus stealing the body? They would have had to fight through an entire squadron of soldiers, both Roman soldiers and temple police, to get to the tomb. They would have had to move this massive stone, and they would have had to steal the body of Jesus Christ. Now that doesn't add up. If you have a detachment of Roman soldiers guarding the tomb is not going to be disturbed. If you have temple police as well there, the tomb is not going to be disturbed. There's no way the disciples could have managed. If you think about it, the disciples, the maximum number of disciples would have been 11, because of course Judas was no longer a part of them. And so 11 men going in and defeating the soldiers from Rome and also the temple police? I don't think so. It doesn't make sense. So the story that was circulated among the Jewish people doesn't make sense, that Jesus had simply had his body stolen by his followers. His followers were afraid. They were cowering in the upper room, hiding from the Roman soldiers. And so this scenario that Jesus' body was stolen by his followers was totally crazy. And so in the TV depiction, it shows that the Roman soldiers are looking for the disciples all around. And Caiaphas, the high priest, is looking for the body of Jesus. And so it shows all of these different factors, and it's very interesting. Well, stay tuned for part 3. We're going to be back in just a minute to talk more about the series AD, The Bible Continues. Don't go away. Well, welcome to the final segment of Christian Answers, and we're talking about the made-for-television Bible series, AD, The Bible Continues. And we're talking about some of the ways in which the series depicts the biblical accounts. And it's very interesting. It gets you thinking about what actually could have happened back then, because, of course, we don't know exactly what happened. We can guess as to what happens, and that's what they do in the series here on television. They're trying to figure out what actually happened. Now, it's very interesting, the relationship between Pilate and Caiaphas in this TV series. We know that there was some kind of tension between Pilate and Caiaphas and the Jewish establishment. But we don't know exactly what their interaction was. This television series tries to fill in the gaps. After Pilate finds out that the tomb is empty, he goes seeking Caiaphas, and he barges into Caiaphas. Caiaphas is participating in some kind of a ritual cleansing, a bath, like many of the Jewish people did during that day and age, ritual cleansing. And Pilate and his soldiers storm in there and say to Caiaphas, "Why did you not tell me that the tomb had been opened and that the body had been gone?" And so Pilate says, "I will take care of this. I will find the disciples. I will put an end to this once and for all, this rumor of resurrection, and I will deal with it because you obviously cannot deal with it." And he told Caiaphas basically that he was incompetent, and the way he's handling things, the Jesus rumor will spread and bring every single rebel or freedom fighter into Jerusalem to oppose the Romans. And so Caiaphas was basically put down by Pilate. And so Pilate then goes out and he finds his soldiers that had been at the tomb, and they were hiding out because they knew that the penalty for leaving the scene of their assignment was death, and so they were hiding out in Jerusalem. He finds them because one of them betrayed the rest of them. Now, that's not in the Bible. It doesn't say anything about the soldiers and what they did after they saw that angel move the stone. It doesn't show anything about that. It does show that they went to Caiaphas first, the soldiers, the Roman soldiers, and said, "The tomb is empty, someone has taken the body." And Caiaphas says, "Well, say to people that you fell asleep and the followers of Jesus stole the body." Just make it as an excuse that you fell asleep, and during the night, someone stole the body. Now, that's a biblical account of what these soldiers were told by Caiaphas, to tell people the line, the party line, the talking points, that while they were guarding the tomb, they fell asleep and then someone stole the body. Now, when you think about that, it doesn't make any sense, because Roman soldiers have a discipline. And when they are stationed to guard something, they don't all fall asleep all at once. They don't all sleep at once. They have a watch. And when 2 or 3 are sleeping, then there might be 1 or 2 or 3 guarding and staying awake. And then when those shift is over, then the ones that were watching, they go to sleep. And then the people who were sleeping, the soldiers that were sleeping, they stand on watch. And so there's an order to guarding a tomb or whatever they are assigned to guard. They don't all just fall asleep all at once. That would have been totally contrary to Roman discipline. These soldiers are trained. The Roman soldiers were the best in the world. They were the best trained in the world. They were the most disciplined in the world. And so as soldiers, they never would have fallen asleep, as Caiaphas wanted them to say. The story doesn't make sense. Well, on top of that, you have the temple guards, who were probably there. We don't exactly know who and what soldiers were there, but according to the made-for-TV series, both the Romans and the temple guards were there. And so the temple guards told Caiaphas that this supernatural being rolled the stone away. He didn't believe that story, so he came up with this story about the followers of Jesus stealing the body. But they would have had to get through the Romans and the temple police, which totally doesn't make any sense. But Pilate finds his soldiers that had run away from the tomb, and what he does is he brings Caiaphas in to his palace, and then he executes the soldiers, which is probably what did in fact happen to the soldiers. And even the story that Caiaphas gives them to tell Pilate and to tell everyone that they fell asleep, that wouldn't help their case. Because if you're a Roman soldier and you've been commissioned to guard something, whether it's a person or a home or a tomb, and you fall asleep on the watch, that is grounds for execution. And so the made-for-television series actually shows a realistic enactment of what might have happened to those soldiers. They would have been executed. Now, even the one who was the informant who betrayed his other fellow soldiers, it shows that he gets killed too, because Pilate considers him guilty of leaving his watch at the gravesite. And so he is executed too. And he also, Pilate also shows that he sent some soldiers to execute the temple police who were on guard. So in other words, he's trying to cover up the whole thing to eliminate any kind of rumors that Jesus rose from the dead, any kind of reason why there might be an insurrection or rebellion in the city of Jerusalem. He wants that totally squelched. And so he goes about trying to kill everyone who was guarding the tomb. He doesn't want any of that supernatural being talk spreading among the people. And so he goes about this execution spree of killing everyone who was at the gravesite. Well, did that happen? We don't know. Again, that's a speculative account of what might have happened. But it does make sense that Pilate would want to try to eliminate the rumors of resurrection, just as the Jewish leaders would have wanted to eliminate the rumors of Jesus' resurrection too. And so Pilate then goes about trying to find the disciples of Jesus. And from the television series, we would kind of get the idea that he wanted to kill the followers of Jesus also, because he didn't want anyone spreading anything about resurrection and all of that. And so that's where the second episode ends, with the disciples leaving Jerusalem, getting out of town and going up to Galilee. Now, if you don't understand where geographically Galilee is, you have Jerusalem in the south, and then you have Galilee in the north. So you have this southern city, Jerusalem. The disciples fled from Jerusalem all the way up to Galilee, and Jesus appears to them again, and then that is where he ascends into heaven, and it shows a really good depiction of that. It shows Jesus walking up the side of a mountain while the disciples watch him, and then he gets closer to the top, and you see clouds coming down, and you see angels, and Jesus just keeps walking up the mountain into these clouds, and it's a pretty good depiction of the actual ascension into heaven. So I would have to say again, this is a very positive depiction of the actual biblical accounts. And stay tuned for Christian Answers for some more episodes later on, because we're going to talk more about this made-for-television movie, A.D. the Bible Continues. Have a great week. We'll see you back next time.